Welcome. Today we'll be talking about Chapter 21 from AMSCO AP European History, which is ideological clashes in the interwar years. The interwar years, as the name suggests, is the period in between the world wars, so 1919 to 1939. What we see is an economic crisis, the Great Depression, and we see the rise of authoritarianism, or the rise of dictators, especially in Russia, which becomes the Soviet Union under Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, Italy with Benito Mussolini, and Nazi Germany with Adolf Hitler. You can see how I've got my note taker structured with the Russian Revolution, some challenges, and then looking at Italy and Germany. Starting first with the Russian Revolution and the Soviet Union. Now, the Russian Revolution of 1917 is going to drastically transform Russia into a communist country, the Soviet Union. And it's important to look at both the long-term and short-term problems in Russia. Long-term, the last time we talked about Russia was at the end of the Crimean War in 1856. You might remember Russia had tried to gobble up this land from the Ottoman Empire. They were defeated by England and France. And they had to kind of withdraw from international affairs for a while because they were behind. And so some long-term problems is kind of this last point, incomplete industrialization. They weren't as industrialized as their neighbors were. You can see here how many railroad tracks they had over time. They do start to industrialize by the turn of the century, by 1917, but for the late 1800s, they are definitely behind, still a largely rural, agrarian, agricultural country. They also were kind of like France was before their French Revolution. They had a strict hierarchy, kind of like the three estates in France. Peasants could not own property, were actually serfs up until the late 1800s. And there was no middle class, which you oftentimes need to have lots of businesses and factories and things like that. And then at the top of that unequal society was the Tsar. Tsar was the fancy word for the emperor, who had complete power. So there is political and social inequality. The Tsar has absolute power. And there's strict hierarchy, no power at all for the peasants or the working class or the middle class. And then not as industrialized as other countries, which is going to lead to poverty and problems for your average Russian. Short-term problems, there were some crises in 1905 and then through to 1917 that are going to exacerbate or make those long-term problems even worse. Russia lost a war in 1905 to Japan. And after they lost that war, which had led to food and fuel shortages throughout Russia, hundreds of thousands of women, men, children protested peacefully at the Tsar's Winter Palace. And the Tsar's troops opened fire. This is what's called Bloody Sunday, where hundreds of peasants, innocent protesters, simply asking for food, were shot and killed. The Tsar, after that initial crisis, Bloody Sunday, he temporarily listened to some advisors about what to do, but ultimately he ignored any advice that would take power from him and just kept on ruling the way he always had. Things got even worse in 1914 when Russia went to war, one of the first countries to go to war. And because they're not as industrialized, they are literally not able to produce enough weapons to supply their troops. They're not able to build enough helmets to outfit their soldiers. So soldiers on the front line are ill-equipped and undersupplied, and those back home were oftentimes faced to wait in long lines because of food shortages and fuel shortages as well. So when we talk about the short-term causes, first we've got Bloody Sunday, where the Tsar, let's say first, peasants protest food shortages, basically. Tsar opens fire, killing, I want to say 300 or so. And then when Russia goes to war, they are unprepared for World War I. There's not enough supplies or weapons, food shortages back at home. And so when the war begins, protesters begin to demand peace and bread. They want to get out of the war, and they want some food. The Russian Revolution is tricky because there's actually two waves of revolution. The first wave of revolution in February or March, depends on what calendar you look at, forces the Tsar to step down, creates a temporary provisional government. But it's within this temporary power vacuum that a new group of people called the Bolsheviks take power. The Bolsheviks were a Russian communist party, and like communists, they believed that the working class should own the means of production. They sought to create a classless, equal society, and they believed that the only way to do that was through immediate, violent revolution led by the elite. Vladimir Lenin was the leader of the Bolsheviks. He had been exiled for a decade or so. It was actually smuggled back into Russia, but by Germany, because Germany was trying to create instability in Russia during World War I. And when you look at these slogans of what the Bolsheviks were fighting for, it really gives us a good sense of who they were. Peace, land, and bread. Peace, get out of World War I. Land, redistribute land to the people, which is certainly a communist idea, bread or food. Worker control of production, all about workers controlling the means of production. And then all power to the Soviets. The Soviet was a workers' council. And so what we have here is we have the Bolsheviks rise to power, and they are demanding peace, land, and bread, and then I'll put here worker control of production. They're trying to create communism here. That first revolution in February, March turns into a second revolution in October or November, because the calendar is weird. And the Bolsheviks rebel. The Bolsheviks, the communists, they organize worker-led town councils in many cities. And these Bolsheviks, these Soviets, these workers, these communists, all kind of the same thing, they take control. Lenin and the Bolsheviks relatively easily are able to take control of the main cities and the government in November of 1917. There's going to be a civil war for the next few years. The communists will eventually win, and they create the Soviet Union or the USSR. The first thing that they do after the Bolsheviks take power is they get out of World War I. They have to sign a treaty called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, where they have to give up huge tracts of land to Germany. So you can see this was the size of Russia. Now they're just here. So all this land, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, they got to give up a lot of that land to leave the war. So we'll say the Bolsheviks take power in November 1917. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Russia leaves World War I, but gives up lots of land to do so. And very quickly, the new Soviet Union, Russia renames themselves the Soviet Union, they begin to implement some communist policies. Vladimir Lenin was the first leader of the Soviet Union until 1924, I believe. And he created something called the New Economic Policy. Basically, Russia was on the brink of economic collapse after World War I and after the Civil War. And so Lenin creates a bunch of reforms to get the economy going. The government takes control of banks. The government takes control of industries. The government centralized power. Some of this is a communist idea, national ownership of banks, national ownership of industries in order to benefit the people. That's kind of a communist idea. But this is not controlled by the people. This is not controlled by the working class. This is the government taking more power. Now, the new economic policy, it worked. It helped the Soviet Union to recover, and they're going to industrialize quite quickly. But this isn't communism. This is not giving ownership of the means of production to workers. It's giving it to the state. So when we talk about Vladimir Lenin, his new economic policy, we'll say this is early 1920s. This gives the government control of banks, industries, things like that. And it does allow the USSR to recover, to rebuild, but it's not communism. When Vladimir Lenin dies, the next leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, leans even further towards totalitarianism, towards a strong government, and away from communism. He rules for 30 years, 1924 to 53. He's going to drastically strengthen the Soviet Union into probably the number one or second most powerful country after the US, at a huge cost. His 5-year plan rapidly industrializes the Soviet Union. There's huge economic growth in the Soviet Union. There's millions of jobs for the working class, but horrible working conditions. Workers were forced to work in these conditions. They were oftentimes abused and underpaid. He also built collectives, which were community-owned farms. He would take land from the wealthy peasants called kulaks and distribute those to landless peasants, certainly a communist idea. But many peasants resisted and refused giving up their land. And so what did he do in response? He starved them to death. He intentionally withheld grain from peasants who resisted, creating what's called the terror famine, killing between 7 and 10 million peasants who starved to death because of this man-made famine that Stalin created to punish his enemies. So, big picture here, Stalin strengthens the USSR, but at a huge cost, with millions dead, and basically Stalin becomes a dictator. So the 5-year plan industrializes the USSR, but again, by abusing and oppressing workers. He creates collectives, which were community-owned farms. And he starves his enemies, or starves those who resist. This is called the terror famine, kills 7 million people. As if that weren't bad enough, again, Stalin is all about trying to have complete power. He's not really a communist anymore. And so what else does he do? Well, he gets rid of any of his enemies. This is called the Great Purge, where he eliminates any of his enemies, anyone who might be a threat. He creates a secret police called the Cheka. Eventually it'll morph into the KGB, and creates incredibly oppressive laws that give him all the power here. And so when we zoom out and we look at Stalin and the Soviet Union in general, okay, Stalin for sure, he transformed the entire government and the economy. This T-chart's not labeled, but on the left side is perhaps the successes, on the right side is the failures. So was Stalin successful? Well, the state took ownership of major industries. There was no private industry. The government also ran agriculture. Now that could be a good thing if the government's run well. Literacy rates also increased as people got an education. Russia became a much more urban country. But at what cost? Well, at the cost of many elite Russians being exiled. At the cost of no private property. You cannot own your own property, you own your own business. At the cost of a centralization of government, the government becomes too powerful or more powerful, basically becoming a dictator. And at the cost of an oppressive political system. So again, Stalin does strengthen the USSR. He makes the Soviet Union into one of the strongest countries in the world, but at the cost of millions dead, at the cost of him becoming a dictator, at the cost of no freedoms for the people. Stalin's going to remain in power for the next 30 years. He'll fight in World War II. He'll be there at the start of the Cold War, and really completely transforms Russia from a struggling, backwards, unindustrialized country in 30 years, transforms it into one of the most powerful countries in the world, but also one with an incredibly oppressive dictator. Shifting gears for the second half of this, looking at the rise of fascism, the rise of dictators, a new form of dictators in Italy and Germany. Now, in order to understand why dictators are rising to power during the interwar years, you've got to understand all of the challenges after World War I. Every single country was massively in debt. The losing countries, Germany especially. Prices were dropping. Currency was basically worthless. There was massive inflation. Sorry, not massive inflation, but money was not worth much because economies were really struggling. People aren't really trading with each other because they are just kind of withdrawing within themselves. And so the kind of like worldwide economy, the worldwide economy struggles after World War I. There's massive debt. There is a weak currency, not much trade. And then the Great Depression hits in 1929. It hits in the US initially, but it very quickly spreads to Europe because so much of Europe was relying on loans from America. So the European economy is already struggling after World War I because of the crisis of World War I. When the Great Depression hits, when the US economy tanks, the US can no longer loan money to Europe, and the European economy is going to tank even more. These are photographs of the stock market crash, Black Tuesday in October 1929. This illustrating kind of the massive unemployment and the anguish that normal people felt because of the Great Depression. And this shows us the effects of this. This is showing us how much wealth people have. The US, you can see the US tanks in 1929, and it lasts for about half a decade. Let's see, where's Germany here? Germany is the dotted line here. So Germany, same thing. Germany tanks quite a bit. Their economy drops quite a bit. So the Great Depression leads to an economic crisis all the way through 1935 or so. As if that weren't bad enough, there were also some political challenges. The Treaty of Versailles had created a League of Nations. That was Woodrow Wilson's idea with the 14 points. And the League of Nations was designed to settle disputes and prevent conflict. The problem was the US didn't join. They didn't want to get involved in European issues. Germany wasn't allowed. Soviet Union wasn't allowed. And so the League of Nations didn't really have any power to actually enforce things. So I'm going to say that there's kind of like a weak political system after World War I. The League of Nations has no power to settle disputes. And there's just like kind of like struggling democracies. Some countries like Germany had never had a democracy before. They had no history of democracy. And so as they turn to democracy and these democracies fail to fix the problems, people want to have a strong leader like a monarch or a Kaiser again. That leads us to fascism. Fascism is a form of dictator. It's a form of authoritarianism or totalitarianism. It basically relies on strong military, nationalism, and public support. So the key points of fascism there, it says statism, the state, the government, is the most powerful thing in the world. It relies on nationalism or public support, and it relies on a strong military. I'm going to actually add a row here just to tell us about fascism in general. So fascism, if I can spell it right, is a definition here. It's a form of dictatorship that relies on a strong military, a strong state, and nationalism or public support. It rises to power in Italy and Germany because they were both disillusioned after World War I. They had a poor economy. They were angry at the Treaty of Versailles. Their democracy had failed to fix these problems. if you think about the Treaty of Versailles, I mean, Germany was destroyed by the treaty. They had to pay reparations. They had to give up land. They had to disarm. They had to admit the war was their fault. Italy just felt like they had 500,000 deaths and they weren't really rewarded at all. They were kind of brushed to the side. And so Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany will rise to power. They will reject democracy. They're going to glorify war, glorify nationalism, and promote almost like a cult around them as the leader. So they reject democracy and they glorify war and nationalism. Looking at Italy first, Benito Mussolini in Italy. Again, Italy struggled after World War I. They were promised certain things from the Treaty of Versailles they didn't really get. They didn't get the land that was promised to them. They suffered the same economic problems other countries did, severe inflation and unemployment after World War I. Their democracy couldn't solve the problems, couldn't solve this economic crisis. And so Benito Mussolini swoops in and takes charge. He was the leader of one of the biggest newspapers in Italy, so he used that as kind of propaganda to get his message out. He decided to ally with businesses against the working class, the total opposite of communism. He marches on Rome with his black shirts, peacefully takes over control of the government. And over the next few years, he manipulates elections to give his party, the Fascist Party, control. He bans freedom of press and bans any other political parties. And so Mussolini, relatively peacefully, although his black shirts would oftentimes use street violence against enemies, Mussolini takes power in Italy. Let's add some notes here, sorry. So Italy struggles again after World War I. They're angry at the treaty. There's inflation, there's unemployment, and they've got a weak democracy. Same problems we'll keep on seeing. So Mussolini takes power in early 1920s. He allies with businesses, which will be a trend of fascism, and he gets rid of freedoms, freedom of press, freedom of political parties. You can see him in this photograph. I mean, remember, fascists, they glorify war, they glorify nationalism. You see both here. He's got his military outfit in a massive parade. Him with his black shirts, again, glorifying war, glorifying the Italian Empire, glorifying imperialism, and using nationalism, huge public support to gain power. This Campo Mussolini, again, glorifying the military. But then he's always watching you. This was propaganda for an election, encouraging people to vote yes, with the face of Mussolini, a face of Big Brother, always watching you, which really illustrates the oppression, political oppression that Mussolini created in Italy. Germany faces the same crisis that Italy faces, except to a much bigger degree. Remember, Germany was destroyed by the Treaty of Versailles. They had to pay huge amounts of reparations and had no money to do it. Germany had a democracy after World War I. It was called the Weimar Republic, but it failed completely. It was unable to solve the crises of the day, partially because Germany had no history of democracy. They didn't really know how to run it. They were too divided, too many political parties. The Weimar Republic didn't have any control over the military, and they couldn't solve this crisis. So the Weimar Republic, after World War I, fails to solve the crisis. There is massive unemployment, massive inflation, and then again, anger at the Treaty of Versailles. These photographs famously show us people taking an entire wheelbarrow full of money just to buy bread, or kids using money as toys. And this shows us inflation. 1 German mark used to be equal to $1. 5 years later, it's worth, you need 1 trillion German marks to have $1's worth of wealth. So money was quite literally worthless. And so it's within that political crisis that Adolf Hitler swoops in. Adolf Hitler creates his own political party, the Nazis. And he initially tried to take power in the 1920s with what's called the Beer Hall Putsch. he and his Nazis get drunk at a beer hall, and they take to the streets to try to overthrow the government in Munich. He's arrested, thrown in prison, only for less than a couple of years. And when he's in prison, he writes Mein Kampf. Mein Kampf means my struggle. It's basically his autobiography, his political philosophy. And he basically says, we need Germany. We need a strong government. We need a strong leader to save Germany. We don't need democracy. Democracy's failed us. We need a strong leader who will use propaganda, use mass media to take power. And Hitler's ideas can really be summarized in two phrases: Lebensraum, or living space, and racial purity. Adolf Hitler believed that Germany needed more space to live in, and the only way to do that was by going to war to gain more territory. And racial purity, Hitler believed in the Aryans, blonde hair, blue-eyed, as the master race, which led to the Holocaust and the elimination of anyone that he considered to be inferior. So we'll say Hitler creates the Nazi Party. Whoops. And his main goals here is racial purity, the expansion of Germany, and the need for a strong leader. Democracy is not going to cut it, in his opinion. And so after Hitler's release from prison in the late 1920s, after his failed revolution, he slowly rises to power with his Nazi political party. And he takes advantage of the challenges in Germany to take power. He blamed the Weimar Republic for all of Germany's problems. He blamed the Weimar Republic for the economic crisis, for the unemployment, the inflation, and for signing the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler runs for office in 1932. He runs for president and loses. But because his Nazi party won 37% of the Reichstag, 37% of the German Congress, Hitler's appointed chancellor by the president, von Hindenburg. The president thought, you know, if I make Hitler chancellor, I can control him, and he won't be a threat. The problem is von Hindenburg dies about a year later, and then there's a mysterious fire with the Reichstag, the German Congress, burns down. To this day, historians do not know who started it. It's quite possible it was an inside job. It's quite possible Hitler started the fire, but we don't know for sure. But what we do know is that Hitler didn't care who actually did it. Hitler blamed the communists. And Hitler used this fire as an excuse to get rid of freedom of speech, to get rid of freedom of press, to get rid of freedom of protest. And he used this crisis, he used this fire to give himself emergency absolute power. So that by 1933, Adolf Hitler, who was never voted into power, by 1933, Hitler is, for all intents and purposes, a dictator. He's banned all political opposition. He's arresting communists. He's gotten rid of freedom of speech. He's given himself the power. Now, the incredible thing about Hitler, I mean, he's evil, obviously, but he's quite brilliant in that Hitler rose to power democratically. He was appointed chancellor in 1932. And then after a fire at the Reichstag, or sorry, let's say there's a fire at the Reichstag. And this is, Hitler uses this as an excuse to gain power. What does he do? Well, he imprisons his political enemies, the communists. He bans freedom of speech, freedom of press, and he gives himself emergency powers called the Enabling Act. So by 1933, Hitler is the dictator of Germany. He takes power democratically. He uses mass media, the radio. He basically put a radio in basically every household in Germany. Powerful speeches and posters. This one says, "Our last hope," Hitler. Massive rallies. And in these rallies and in these posters, he always spoke to German nationalism. Remember, fascism is all about appealing to nationalism, getting public support. So he always promised to restore greatness and honor and glory to Germany, to make Germany great again. He said the only way we can do that is by electing me. The only way we can do that is by going to war. And the only way we can do that is by getting rid of those who are inferior. Communists, Jews, homosexuals, the disabled, those that are mentally ill. And he used fear and intimidation and violence to do this. He had his Gestapo, his secret police, the SS, which were his secret army, basically, and the brown shirts, kind of like his personal bodyguards, using force, terror, intimidation to rise to power. So once in power, Hitler uses both nationalism and force to take power. He uses propaganda and speeches to appeal to nationalism, make Germany great again. And then he also uses the secret police and the military to spread fear and intimidation and terror. These two photographs showing that the Nazi Party is the only political party. The swastika, the red, black, and white there. Sorry. And so Hitler and Mussolini are both quite similar. They're both fascists. They both take advantage of crises in their respective countries. They both glorify the military and glorify nationalism. And so Hitler and Mussolini, Germany and Italy, very quickly ally together. And they look to Spain as well, to also possibly ally with Spain. Spain faced the same problems that every other country faced: inflation, unemployment, a weak government, weak democracy. And a fascist takes power in Spain as well, Francisco Franco, who was a general of the Spanish army. Now, after Franco takes power, I suppose as he takes power, there is a civil war between the army and the government, between Franco, the fascists, and the government, those supporting democracy. Franco ends up winning, the fascists end up winning, largely because Francisco Franco and the fascists got support from Hitler and from Mussolini. Spanish Civil War is sometimes called the testing ground for World War II, because that's where Hitler tested a lot of his weapons. And it was really the first direct war between fascism and democracy. And fascism won. And so the Spanish Civil War really emboldened and inspired Hitler to go to war. If Spain can do it, so can he. So we have the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 39. Franco and the fascists take power. I'll say Franco represents the army. And again, this is like a testing ground for World War II in a couple of ways. First, this is like the first conflict of fascism versus democracy. Fascism wins. And then Hitler tests his weapons in Spain. Most famously illustrated by this mural, Guernica, by Pablo Picasso. Guernica was a Spanish town that was bombed by the army. And so Pablo Picasso used his Cubist style to illustrate the anguish and suffering of the people. See the expressions on their faces, the trauma that they're facing. But you can also see maybe some light, some possible hope amidst all of this destruction. So that by the time we get to 1939, I was only able to find a map in French. We have a few democratic countries: England, France, and a few others. We have Russia, who's communist. But really, we have a bunch of dictatorships. Hitler in Germany, Mussolini in Italy, Franco in Spain, and a whole bunch of other dictators. So By 1939, democracy has failed across most of Europe. You have a communist dictator in the Soviet Union, Stalin. We have fascism and other dictators throughout Central and Eastern Europe. And so this crisis that leads to World War II partially is a collapse of democracy and the rise of dictators. The last thing that we'll talk about is the response to the Great Depression, just real quick. Every single country had to deal with this massive economic crisis. And whether they turned to democracy like England or the US or France, or whether they turned to a dictator like in the Soviet Union or Germany, most countries increased government spending to build their way out of the Great Depression. Sometimes called deficit spending or Keynesian economics, named after John Maynard Keynes, who was a British economist, who basically says when you're in an economic crisis, when you have no money, the government should actually increase spending. They should borrow money. Now, that'll create a temporary deficit, but it'll create jobs. It'll stimulate the economy. It'll put people to work. And so the US is able to recover because of something called the New Deal. Billions and billions and billions of dollars of government programs putting people to work. England does the same thing. They focus on new industries like the automobile industry and electronics. The Soviet Union is able to rebuild because of the 5-year plan. But Germany can't, at least until Hitler takes power. So we'll just say real quickly, some countries are able to recover from the Great Depression because of increased government spending, called deficit spending. This shows us how much money the US government spent under FDR during what's called the New Deal, when they're able to completely save the economy. Increasing federal spending to stimulate the economy. And this shows how much countries are able to recover. The US is able to almost nearly recover. Germany, able to recover, at least once Hitler takes power. England as well. France suffering for a variety of reasons. Basically, France was incredibly divided. But countries are eventually able to spend their way, build their way out of the Great Depression because of increased government spending. So as we recap, the first part of this lecture was on the Russian Revolution. Russia turns into a communist dictatorship under Lenin and Stalin. They create an incredibly oppressive regime. And that oppression spreads to Germany and Italy as well. Germany and Italy struggling with unemployment, inflation, a weak government, anger at the Treaty of Versailles. So Mussolini takes power in Italy. Hitler takes power in Germany. And they create this new brand of government called fascism that glorifies the war, glorifies the military, glorifies nationalism, and also uses political oppression to take complete power. This crisis will eventually lead directly into World War II.